This is August the 15th, 2021, and we are on the third sermon on science and the Bible. The first two that we discussed, we talked about the fact that I often use atheists and agnostic scientists because if they have any bias, it's against the Bible, against Scripture, against the concept of God. So when we quote from them and they submit evidence or data for us, it carries a lot of weight. And in those first two sermons, I made the point that one of the greatest minds of the 20th century was Dr. Fred Hoyle, who was an atheist and an agnostic. And he wrote a book called Evolution from Space. And he was incredible in physics and many other things. And he remained an agnostic. But one thing that he did that others paid a lot of attention to was he established mathematically, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that life happening in the idea of coming out of a warm soup and evolving by chance was an absolute impossibility. He put that impossibility at one chance out of 10 to the 40,000th power, which is 10 multiplied by itself 40,000 times. And to give you an idea, all the atoms in the universe, for every star within all the galaxies, all the planets, all whatever, asteroids and so forth, all the atoms are 10 to the 78th power or 10 to the 82nd power, depending on how you calculate it. So that's 10 times itself, 82 times. Whereas the chance of life taking place the way the typical evolution is taught in the college textbooks, in the high school textbooks, and so forth and so on, is 10 to the 40,000th power. 10 multiplied by itself 40,000 times. In fact, Fred Hoyle and others went on to say that if the entire universe were this soup, this ideal soup from which life evolved, there wouldn't be one chance in 10 to the 40,000th power for any number of reasons, which we'll get into over time. The other thing that I pointed out in the last two sermons was that there's a lot of misconceptions, both biblically by people who profess to be Christians, as well as by scientists, whether Christian or non-Christian scientists, whether atheists or non-atheists. There are a lot of misconceptions. And so it was very striking when you had the greatest physicists of the 1900s and into this century, the greatest physicists coming out who were agnostics and saying that everything in their science, and astrophysics and quantum physics and physics in general and so forth, points to the fact that there had to be not only a designer, but a designer who intended to have life like us on the earth. And I'm quoting there the great Stephen Hawking, who was an agnostic / atheist until his dying day. And we went into one of the most famous scientists in the United States, Jastrow, and he talks about the fact that in physics and astronomy, they've come to the conclusion, almost all the physicists he talks to, that there had to have been a designer, and a designer that intended life. And he said, it's not so unlike the first chapter of Genesis. We only disagree, he being an agnostic, in the details. So those are huge pieces of information that we want to keep as we go forward with this. Now, today, I wanted to talk about how this looks to a mechanical engineer or electrical engineer, geological engineer, any number of people who approach it. And I want to mention about 10 additional points that point to issues around the dating of the earth and the dating of life on the earth. But first, I want to make some distinctions so that next week we can follow up on this. This is an advertisement for next week on these distinctions. One thing is that part of the data that we look at is determining or suggesting whether there is in fact a source for everything that we see in the universe, or there's no source. Another way of putting that is there a designer or no designer? That's the first thing that we're dealing with as we sift the data. The second thing I want to bring out, and this is what I'm going to address next Sunday, the 22nd of August, is the difference, the distinction between the dating of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in beginning God created the two heavens and the earth. We'll get into all of that next week. Versus Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, where he begins to create for man. Two distinct, different circumstances, completely different, often confused in Reformed theology, and often confused even among the scientists who think they're defending the truth one way or the other. So we must remember, which we'll address next week, the difference between the age as implied in Genesis 1:1 versus what takes place in the second verse going forward. The third thing, I want to re-emphasize this. It's really restating what I just said, but as it translates into data. As you read the science, and I've been reading this pretty actively since the late 50s, 1950s. By the way, the part we ordered for the church air conditioner, I think they're looking for in the tombs of the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. You should have seen the technician with my wife Betty. He said, well, we can order this part if anybody has it, and maybe we can find it if anybody has it. And he says, do you know how old this thing is? So from the 1950s, one of my hobbies has been science and the Bible. And just a next minute or so, couple of minutes, in my background, when I studied at the University of California, Berkeley, one of my closest mentors was Donald Savage, who was head of the paleontology department at Berkeley. And he was instrumental in developing the potassium argon method for dating radioactive rocks and so forth. So it's not like I was educated in a protective environment and grew up with one opinion. I come out of a very mixed background, liberal and conservative, traditional, non-traditional, and so forth. And I studied there at UC Berkeley for about 12 or 13 years. So, what is the discussion today? Well, we have a number of mechanical engineers. Walter Sinbala, by the way, got his master's and his Ph.D. in this area at Caltech, which is a very good school. Taylor and Spentner. Leo Spentner was one of what they used to call the Hungarian Martians. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Hungarian Martians, but the story goes something like this. They wanted to know if there were any other life in the universe, and they asked, in an interview back in the early 1900s, they asked, do you think there's life on Mars? And he says, we're already here. and it was a group of Jewish scientists, mostly physicists, but other areas as well, mathematics and so forth, who, along with Albert Einstein and Oppenheimer and Teller and these others, did so much in terms of advancing science and technology in so many ways. And they were nicknamed the people from Mars, the Martian group. That's Leo Spintner. I'll come back to him a little later. Spillard, actually. And their whole argument, and this goes to source or no source, all right? This goes to the notion of designer or no designer. Not proof that Genesis chapter 1 is true or that the Bible is inerrant. But they operate from, there's actually 4 laws of thermodynamics. The first law is the zero law, because they had laws 1, 2, and 3, and then they thought, well, there's actually one that applies to, we'll call that zero. It's fundamental. We won't go into all of those, although Sean does have a slide up that sort of translates it into layman's perception that he can pull up. But the 2 laws that they work with are the conservation of energy, that within this system of the universe, energy cannot be added or taken away, following relativity, E equals mc squared, that mass times the speed of light squared. Energy can change, it can move, but it can't be added, it can't be taken away. And this is not an argument against God. This actually is talking about the closed system, if you will, of the universe. All right. But the second law of thermodynamics is that once you start with this source of energy, so this can be the Big Bang, this could be the creation by God, this could be any number of things, but once you start with that source, then entropy occurs. What happens is it winds down. And there are different illustrations for this to make it more understandable for the layman. Simplest is a cup of hot coffee in a closed room, and the coffee stays hot as the energy begins to transfer into the air in the room until the temperature of the hot coffee is now the same temperature as that in the room. Energy has not been added or deleted, it's transferred, and it's in a state of equilibrium. And in fact, the second law of thermodynamics applies at the macro level, the whole universe, or at a piece of the macro level, like a star or the sun, and at the micro level. And so these scientists, Walter, Sanabala, Taylor, and Spintner, who are dealing with mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, geological engineering, and physics and engineering, and these other things, say that the second law of thermodynamics compels us to not see as reasonable some evolution out of soup. And they handle the argument in various ways, some going into microbiology, some going into structure. But in all of these cases, they say that this concept is just defeated by the second law of thermodynamics, that everything winds down. Now, a fellow by the name of James Maxwell came along and put this proposition together, that if you had these molecules of energy, that maybe you could have like a doorway in a closed environment, and all the lower energy molecules would be in the left, and you could sort of move the higher energy molecules to the right. So even though you have this second law applying at the macro and the micro level, you have this little box that sort of contradicts it. And this is where Leo Szilard, another brilliant physicist, came along some years later and showed that the actual work it takes to segregate the two equals the loss in the energy, so the entropy remains the same. The second law of thermodynamics is saying what Fred Hoyle, the atheist, said, that it's impossible for this kind of thing to take place. Now, there are one advertisement for the sermon beyond next week's sermon, where we go into what does Genesis chapter 1 really say. So that I'll give you an example and aside here. There's a story I think that'll help illustrate it. There was a man, and he developed this bad habit. He started stealing lumber from various lumber yards. And he felt bad about it, and he went to his priest, his confessor, and he explained that he had stolen some lumber from this lumber yard for this building project. And the priest said, okay, and here's your penance. And a few days later, he comes in with the same confession. I've stolen lumber from this lumber yard. And his father confessor says, this was just a few days ago you were here. But he says, okay, let's do this, and here's your penance, and I want you to say these prayers, and don't hesitate to come back. And about 4 or 5 days goes by, and he goes back, same thing. And then it happens within a week, and he goes back. And finally, the father confessor says, I think we're going to work up a novena for you. Now, that's an elaborate prayer and penance type of attitude thing. He says, I don't know what to do about you, but I think we need to build a novena for you. And the man says, I don't know what that is, but I can get the lumber for it. That is sort of the attitude of both the evolutionists and the Christian defenders. When I've gone through many books, hundreds of books, many articles. The evolutionists always go back and want to find a rationalization, a justification, we don't know this, but this is what it could be. The same thing with the Christian defenders. We'll go back and under the assumption that I have to defend the Word of God because it teaches clearly that everything was made no more than 6,000 years ago. They go back, naturally with that defense, but they're wrong in their interpretation of what Genesis actually says, which we'll get into next week. But that tendency to rationalize and defend your own position runs throughout these. So I want to give you today about 10 different considerations that are compelling that would suggest a young earth, or at least a young part of the earth, or young creation in some sense, and then comment on how we should think about them until after next week's sermon. The first one is after the second law of thermodynamics, which nobody has overturned in any discipline, is that there's very little sediment on the seafloor. Now what happens is that you have all of this being deposited into the sea on a regular basis, just humongous tons, 20 billion tons a year per year. And the sediment that is built up on average throughout all the oceans of the world is about 1,300 feet. And at the current rate of deposit, that would take about 12 million years as opposed to over 3 billion years from the time of the ocean. So that would suggest that. Now, this argument of the young Earth arguers is countered by the fact that those in science say, well, the plate tectonics, that as they shift, it absorbs some of that. It does, but it doesn't absorb anything more than about 10% of it. So the reality is that the sediment, if the Earth had these same conditions going on or in a similar pattern, the Earth would be no more than 12 million years, 10 million years, 15 million years, certainly not 3 billion years, but certainly not 6,000 years. But it still argues to the younger time. The second point that's pointed out by the geological engineers is the bending of rocks in these sediment layers, like in the Grand Canyon or the Great Basin across the United States. And one of these is the Tapiot sandstone, which in various places is 100 to 325 feet thick, and it is bent at right angles. Now, you can only do that if it is soaking wet, because it's bent without a break. All of these bends that I'm talking about are without breaks, without breaking, without a crack. And the only way you can do that is that if it's completely water soaked. And so these bent layers that are all over the globe, and as much as a bend of 90 degrees without breaking, certainly suggest that this was done underwater. And people, the Christian, like Christian Research Center or Answers in Genesis, they will run to the Noah's flood, Henry Morris, biblical flood, and ice epic and so forth. They'll run to that. We're going to help correct that next week, because there was another period in which the earth was completely underwater, and that was verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1. The earth was completely covered by the waters as the Spirit hovered over it. But that definitely is an argument for these things took place in a catastrophic condition. That's another thing that you'll see the mechanical and electrical and geological engineers talk about, is that so many things argue towards events like Mount St. Helens. The sedimentary layers that were laid down by Mount St. Helens and the events that happened there, those had been described, like in the Grand Canyon, as being over hundreds of millions of years. It was 2 days from Mount St. Helens that they had the same results in miniature form. And so they argue that, so even the Grand Canyon, it was more the result of some catastrophe the biblical flood would do, as an example. The other is a lady by the name of Dr. Mary Schweitzer found a Tyrannosaurus rex. I've always wanted to find the Tyrannosaurus rex ever since I was little. They were one of my favorite dinosaurs. I don't know how they brush their teeth with those little hands. And you'd think that they'd have to brush their teeth a lot because they had a meat diet. Well, Tyrannosaurus rex is supposed to have been extinct for 68 million years. But what she found in this Tyrannosaurus rex in Montana, Hell's Point, Montana, is protein collagen, and bacteria cannot make that. That has to have come from the original living source, and other soft tissue. Now, in the world of evolutionists, there were those who dismissed it and those who accepted it, and the debate went on for a few years. Virtually everybody accepts it. Now they realize they have to be dealing something because it has implications. That this soft tissue condition, this collagen that we find in Egyptian mummies, or in the Swiss Alps when we found the Tyrolean corpse that had it frozen, that would go back maybe a few thousand years, not 68 million. So it raises the question of, is our dating of 68 million sound? Really? Are you saying that these soft tissues and this protein collagen can exist for 68 million years? And this reminded them of something else. They found the same kind of thing. She did this in, I think, 1993 or thereabouts. And they did the same kind of thing. They found something in salt crystals in about 1960. And they had dated the salt crystals to about 500 million years. And it was dismissed out of hand by everybody. And then they found something that was dated at 250 million years. We'll get into those dating sources like potassium, argon, and so forth later on. And they found the soft tissue and the protein collagen and so forth in those. And they said, well, and now with the dinosaur that Dr. Mary Schweitzer found, now they're even going back and looking at the findings from 1960 and 500 million. And it really does raise questions about these datings that seem to be so old. The next is the faint young sun paradox. The rate of fusion of hydrogen into helium in our sun, when you back it up through computer simulated models, would suggest that if you go back to how long ago the sun is supposed to have existed, that the sun would have resulted in an earth temperature of 31 degrees Fahrenheit when all of this stuff is supposed to be developing, which would not have supported life. Now, that's agreed to by everybody, for and against defending Scripture. That's agreed to by everybody. So it's a real dilemma along those points. The rate of the magnetic field's decay. And this too is agreed to by everybody. The current rate of the decay, remember thermodynamics, the second law, entropy continues to increase until a state of, equilibrium as it approaches absolute zero, nothing, which is taking in the second and the third law. Entropy is, winding down, right? That hot coffee cup becoming cooler. Well, the magnetic field is decaying, and that is consistent with this whole principle of the second law of thermodynamics. But it's decaying at a rate that would suggest that the Earth could be no more than 20,000 years old. So again, we run back to that lumber yard. And the Christians are saying this is proof that the earth is very, very young. And the evolutionists and those who equate that with the age of the earth, two different things actually, they're running over here and saying, well, the rate of decay had to have changed. Now this is an argument. The rate of things changing is what Bible believers have believed all along. The flood of Noah was a cataclysmic change in the ordinary weather. And so now you have the other side, who always criticize that position, running to explain things like the faint sun or the rate of decay of the magnetic field of the earth, and so on. The helium in radioactive rocks. The amount of helium that are supposed to be there for these very old rocks, there's too much of it. There's too much of it. And so this raises the whole question of how much helium was there to begin with, and could it even be there? The answer is, by everybody, is no. And so again, this raises the question on the evolutionist, uniformitarian, of saying, well, things had to have been different. But it's a powerful problem to be solved for them. The other thing that we find is that carbon-14, which turns into nitrogen-14, and has a ratio to carbon-12, but carbon-14 in fossils, coal, and diamonds, this is sort of like soft tissue. It's the same kind of thing. You have diamonds that would be dated at 1 to 3 billion years old with carbon-14 in them that would date it at 55,000 years old. Now, let me just say how those at Berkeley or Harvard or Yale or Princeton or any number of places would argue. They would say that, well, carbon-14 is not reliable with these very old things. But the flip side of that is just as true. Carbon-14 we know is reliable. It has a half-life of 5,730 years. Now, what that means is that in hundreds of thousands of years, all of it is gone, maybe less than 1 million years. You know, you go half, and then half of a half, and then half of a half, and then half of a half of a half, and so forth. And it takes you a while to get there. But certainly not tens of millions of years, not hundreds of billions of years, and things of that nature. Not at all. So it could just as equally be true that the carbon-14 in fossils, like the soft tissue in the dinosaur, since it dates that dinosaur at 50,000 years instead of 68 million, it could be the younger date rather than the older date. And for this reason, this other side that keeps running back to the lumberyard of evolution and uniformitarianism, they say, okay, we will only use carbon-14 to date wood and cloth and organic things. We won't use it to date these other things because it contradicts the other things. Another argument that's made is comets at one point were perceived as existing and being as old as the sun within our solar system. And we now know that they're only about 10,000 years old at most. And so this is up for grabs as to what the implications of that is all about. There's very little salt in the sea. The amount of salt that's being dumped in the sea every year, I have the figure here, 458 million tons of salt is being dumped into the sea every year. At this rate, our oceans would be much, much saltier. If you take the salt content that is currently in them, it would reach a date that would go back to 42,000 years. Again, not 6,000 years, but 42,000 years. I have two more. DNA in ancient bacteria that is supposed to be 250 to 270 million years old. the ancient bacteria, again, arguing with the arguments of the uniformitarian evolutionists, the whole realm of science, which, by the way, even if you're as famous as some of the scientists I named earlier, you won't be given a job at even institutions like an FIU, let alone an Oxford, Harvard, or what have you, if you believe in design in these fields. You have DNA in layers that are supposed to be 270 million years old. And even from this side, from the evolutionist side, they are saying there should have been so many mutations that this same organism existing today, that the DNA would be, structurally the same, but very different in the variety of mutations. And they're virtually identical. So it raises the question of how could this not go through what every other presumption is, or is this layer really 270 million years old? You have one other I want to talk about and then draw a conclusion and set it up for next week and the week after. And that is the moon. The idea that the moon was, from the science standpoint, the moon was caused by a break-off from the Earth. And people didn't pay a lot of attention, even though this was brought up, and I was reading about it in the 50s. The moon is receding from the Earth. It's getting further and further away. And I don't seem to be able to hold this mic in my pocket for some reason. It's getting further and further away. And that has implications. Now, science didn't pay much attention to this until Apollo 11, Apollo 13, and so forth, when you're going to land on the moon and you're going to do different things. And calculations have to be very exact. This was a byproduct of that. And it's receding at the rate of 1.5 inches per year. Now, since it's, 225,000, 250,000 miles away, 1.5 inches per year is not a great deal. But if you work that backwards, it's touching the Earth 1.5 million years ago. And the moon is supposed to be almost as old as the Earth. You follow me? So this is a real problem. I mean, it really is. And the other side will say, well, when it exploded from the Earth, it was actually hit by something, deflected in an orbit, maybe by Jupiter, and it knocked off a piece, and it got to where it is, almost, and then it's been receding. But if you believed that the moon was created in 4000 BC, or roughly there, it's in about the right place. It's in the right place. You follow me? In all of these, you have these questions, and each side wants to interpret it in line with the Christian says, I'm defending the Word of God. I know it's true, so it has to be this interpretation. The other guys are saying, we really want this to be true. We don't want a designer. This is many of them, not all of them. Because as you've heard me quote from Stephen Hawking and Jastrow and many others, I could quote from 100 literally, of agnostic physicists who talk about there had to be a designer. But anyway, those two camps that keep running back to their lumber yards. Well, we're going to talk about Stephen Ball, a Ph.D. physicist who is a Christian and believes in an old earth, but he believes in the literal interpretation of Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. And that's where we're going to go next week. We're going to talk about the difference between the original creation and then when God began to work with the earth to make it for man. Two different time periods, and why the Hebrew says that. And then we'll get back to some of the arguments again on how you had to have a designer, and biologically, from an evolutionary standpoint, even the agnostics, Fred Hoyle, among many of the most eminent brains who are not Christians, not believers in God, who say it simply couldn't happen, and it had to have been from some supernatural source. In concluding on the electrical engineering by Dr. Taylor, he takes that whole second law of thermodynamics and talks about the fact that something started all this. Something started all this. And when you look at the intelligence that's in the DNA and the RNA, it's intelligence far beyond our capability. And he talks about the fact that the actual machinery in this and in the cells is more complicated than man has yet been able to produce. Now, I said I was going to also bring up that 1 in 10 to the 40,000th. Within the last 15 years, what has come to be known, and we'll get into this in a later discussion, is that it's not just the information in the DNA that's driving this. They have found what they call epigenetic. In other words, beyond that information. That it's actually not just the information that's in there, but positioning of certain structures actually determines, for instance, this wonderful body you see before you. Why my arms are where they are. Why my legs are as long as they are. I won't go into the other parts, but the point is that the actual three-dimensional reality of form and of information is determined not by the information in the DNA, but by positioning of other things involved. How many are these other things? Well, if we just take one example, the 5 sugars that spell 200,000 different words in how it actually and how this thing actually appears physically within our space-time dimension. How Rick looks, right? How I look. When you combine that with what Fred Hoyle said, 10 to the 40,000s, he was dead after they discovered this. This takes that 10 to, you can't even imagine. This is an additional several 100,000 variations that have to be exact. So that 10 to the 40,000s just goes way out of sight. All that we'll cover, hopefully, in concepts and verbiage that we can understand after next week's explanation of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and then verse 2 and verse 3, and what that actually says in the Hebrew. God bless you all. Amen.